What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. With the effective removal of Hela from the metagame with the OTA, the metagame has been allowed to flourish and grow, and different kinds of strategies have been cropping up that were utterly unviable under the previous regime. Now, this is one of those strategies, and I think it's worth putting at the beginning of this video because the play rate, especially at top infinite, is very, very high. I'm not going to go out here and say this is the best deck in the game full stop. Typically, I tend to include it in sort of a group kind of thing where I talk it as one of the best decks in the game. And also, this is the kind of deck where the more it is played, the more actually targeting it can work, and the more there are pretty clear answers to what it is doing. But in as much as these are a snapshot in time, this is perhaps the highest combination of play rate and win rate that I can talk about in a reasonable sense to justify it being at the top of this list. Right now, if you look at Untapped, there are 1,000 games of basically this list with Captain Marvel over Galacta. That is, of course, the list that I covered in yesterday's video, the Player Haters Ball. There are multiple players in the top 20 who've been playing this, myself and JD McDonaldinho, among others. It is a very straightforward deck. The one change that I have made here is actually pulling the trigger on putting Galacta in over Captain Marvel. That is a nod to the fact that there are more mirrors now. And if there are more mirrors, the best way for me to try to win them is by having more points than my opponent. If I am playing a 4-12 and they are playing a 4-5, I don't really care that that 4-5 can go to the correct location at the end of the game because I'm simply going to have more points than them in a meaningful enough way that is going to take me over the top. Another change you can make along these lines is trying to get Gladiator in here. There is only one bad hit for Gladiator in a mirror, that is Sandman. Every other thing, Gladiator is just a 3-8, and again, the way to tech this deck against the mirror is to just simply have more points than your opponent is able to have. If this deck has a weakness, that weakness is very clearly the fact that it doesn't actually go very, very tall. Adding Gladiator, adding Galacta are ways to address that weakness and to exploit that weakness when you are facing the mirror. This is a Hate Bears deck, and the reason I put it at the front is because it informs a lot of what other decks are doing. What I mean by that is there are a lot of decks that sort of are like this but aren't fully committing to it, and you're going to see a lot of Gorgons and a lot of Mobius. When you look at what the defining tech cards in this metagame are, it's Shang-Chi, Gorgon, and Mobius. So when you think about what is allowing these decks to exist, I think understanding that this is a deck that dodges Shang-Chi and runs Gorgon and Mobius is probably the right place to start. So what's up with all this Gorgon? Why are people playing a bunch of Gorgon? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that it is a reasonable enough card against Agamotto, which means we have come to the Agamotto section of this tier list. We're going to be covering 3 different Agamotto decks here, and all of them are going to take similar but different enough approaches that they deserve to be covered in detail on their own. This is, of course, the first of the Agamotto decks, and in my opinion, likely the best. It is the Season Passler. You probably are familiar if you're a longtime viewer. The basic premise here is that this is a good cards mid-range deck that incidentally has immense power attached to Agamotto himself, especially in the form of Images of Icon. Using Sam Wilson to get multiple dudes on the board, using King Atri as a draw your spells bot that also gets transformed with Images of Icon. A lot of what this deck is trying to do is make 3 copies of Galacta or Gwenpool, or in a pinch Agamotto himself, and enable yourself to go over the top of other mid-range decks with immense power generated from plays like that. In the games where you aren't doing that, you are simply playing, a pile of some of the absolute best cards in the game. You have incredibly useful stuff in here, a lot of very powerful cards. You have Iron Patriot stuff, you have Sam Wilson stuff. It scales up into Galacta and Gwenpool stuff. Agamotto himself, even when you're not playing Images, is still a very relevant card. You have Shang-Chi. You kind of are covering all angles here. And one thing that I will note is I am very sure at this point that playing Loki in this deck right now is probably a mistake. There's a world in which you could convince yourself that it's reasonable mirror tech. I can't really say for sure whether it is or it isn't right now, but the preponderance of people playing Gorgon and Mobius as a way to deal with that kind of thing means that even if you are going to be winning the mirrors off of Loki, which I am not positive that you are still going to be in a pretty awkward situation against a lot of the decks that are sort of prepared for that to happen. And this deck does not have the play rate, and in my opinion, I'm not even sure Agamotto has the play rate, to justify you playing Loki to try to beat it, even if that is true that it does, which I'm not sure about either. Fourange is the new 3, aka the butt build of Agamotto, is a little bit heavier on the 4 drops here. The idea here is very straightforward. You are going to do the same thing as the Season Passler deck is, but you're going to have more beef. And because you have more beef, you're going to have more points, your high rolls are going to be higher, and you get a better sense of what your deck is actually going to be doing, because when you actually start with a hand that has like a 1, a 2, and a 3 in it, you know that the rest of your deck is going to come through in situations like that. When you get your early curve in this deck, it can be a snap condition depending on the matchup, and that means that you're going to see a lot of valuable equity from a deck like this, because you know that if you're doing your early stuff, the rest of your deck is basically late game, and you're going to be doing something stupid with it. This is a deck that plays Anti-Venom without any ways of making Anti-Venom not like that, and I think that that's a very reasonable thing to do in a world where a lot of what Anti-Venom is going to hit is going to be like spells from Agamotto. It's a reasonable thing to do in a world where a lot of what you're playing in this deck are cards that you're playing for their effects and not for their bodies. But it is the kind of thing that can have downsides, like, God forbid you actually hit your Agamotto with the guy. It does suck when you do that. Generally speaking, though, this is a deck that is able to have very dangerous game plans applied to your opponent. This is a deck that is sort of like the big brother of the previous deck that we talked about, where it's a little less consistent, but the power level is much higher because of the additional 4 drops that we have access to. Last up of the Agamotto decks, this one is for the Sera control lovers. If you like feeling like you're never really out of a game, this is probably the list for you. I'm not overly convinced that this is the direction people should be going. I do actually like the kitty stuff in Agamotto shells. I'm into that stuff. I'm not overly enthused by being a full tech deck this early in a metagame. Remember, we just had an OTA, and this can be the kind of deck where it's very valuable to have Enchantress, because there definitely are some decks that are capitalizing on a relative lack of Enchantress. When I talked about like the 3 most relevant tech cards in the game, none of them were Enchantress, and so there's definitely like some ongoing decks that are going to be expecting you to not have that card that you will be able to blow out with that card. But I'm not sure it's overall worth the sacrifices that you're making in order to get it in the deck when you compare it with cards that are actually good with images of Icon, things of that nature. It's a little bit like, it can be better, but a lot of the time it's going to be worse. So this is a deck that is a little bit more control-oriented, a little bit more reactive tech card-oriented, where other Agamotto decks are simply looking to overwhelm with power via images and via the ability to play, like, whatever the free card is off of Anti-Venom, or just make a giant guy off of Gwenpool and Galactoprox, things like that, where it's like, this is a deck that is much more reactive, where those decks are much more consistently outputting good points with high rolls attached. You have some of them, like you have Galacta and Gwenpool, you have Images of Icon, but you also have these like clunky 4s and some cards you don't necessarily want to transform all of the time. It's a little bit of a trade-off. From here, we segue into the sort of mid-range revival section, where there are a lot of decks that were previously pretty hard to play into Hela that are now much easier to play that it doesn't exist. And so that you have a lot of decks that are trying different strategies. And I realize at this point, I think mid-range is perhaps too wide a word. And what I'm really trying to say is just like a deck that does points, right? Like, we're talking about different ways of putting points on the board. That's what Marvel Snap is about. We're putting points on the board. What Hela does is sort of stat check everything. And if you can't pass the stat check, you're not playable. And so now that there is no longer a massive stat check in the game that just instantly beats you, you are able to have a bunch of different varieties of decks that put points on the board in different ways and have different types of interaction and have different ways for you to counter them. And all of that is what leads to metagame diversity, in my opinion. Now, this is a list that is in a very interesting spot, which is to say, it does get to have Gorgon in it. I think Gorgon right now is a very relevant tech card. It doesn't take any hits from Gorgon, and you can try to fit a Mobius in, but I'm not sure you're supposed to. This is a list that has the ability to get a Mobius in here, but you are giving up something meaningful when you do it. What this list is meant to do is go max power with the ability to go extremely tall or go relevantly wide. So you can be either a Sam Wilson Captain America, move the shield around, play Spectrum type of mid-range deck, or you can be a Moonstone double up your Iron Man on one lane and then have a double Iron Man in the middle lane kind of thing. Like, you can do a lot of really powerful stuff with this deck, but you do have to commit to one or the other. Notable weaknesses. Ravonna Renslayer is like a pretty good card in this deck, but there are a lot of people playing Mobius. That will come up. You are also an anti-Venom deck. There are a lot of people playing Mobius. That will come up. Then there are, of course, the fact that, like, you know, if people are playing like Mobius Sandman, a lot of your final turns with this deck are 3/3, and that sort of pigeonholes you into being a Spectrum deck in the Mobius Sandman matchup. And if you're not able to do the Iron Man stuff, especially if you're not able to double it up, they might just be able to reasonably outpoint you if you didn't get a good start. This deck can have good starts, like Sam Cap type stuff. That will usually get you over the top of those decks in at least 2 lanes when you're playing a Spectrum at the end, but it's not a guarantee, and you actually are meaningfully disrupted by a Sandman. This is one of my pet decks. I really do enjoy playing it a lot, but I do think that with the advent of a bunch of people playing the Sandman stuff, it might not be in the best position, and it's not the kind of deck that can really afford to get Mobius in without giving something else up that is majorly important. Now, what you could do is go back to the Doom 2099 version of this, where not necessarily of this, but the Doom 2099 Spectrum ongoing deck, because I think that deck, for example, just sort of hard beats every Sandman deck. It's just like a bigger version of that. And so you are able to just like curve out, and you don't have to care about doing 3/3 on the final turn of the game, and you don't have to care about Mobius and Mobius messing up your stuff. You don't have to care about any of that stuff. So I do think that there's maybe room for that kind of deck to come back in the meta, despite the fact that Doom 2099 was just nerfed. It's very difficult for pretty much any Scream deck to be bad as long as mid-range decks are playable, although I do think it is notable that what Scream does have going against it right now that is keeping it from the very tippy top of the metagame is that it is not a functional Agamotto deck, and it's not particularly great against them. You can and will absolutely get blown out if the Agamotto deck manages to play their Sam Wilson and just moves their shield around the entire game and then transforms that shield into something with images of Icon. That's a really powerful playline against you as a Scream player, because it's taking half of your Scream scaling and saying, actually, not only do you not get to choose what your Scream debuffs go on to, they also just like don't ever end up mattering. It just gets rid of half your Scream scaling. So every Agamotto deck has access to a playline that just by the nature of it existing makes your best card into a worse card. And that really does matter. This is still like a very solid deck, but you are going to have like a newly introduced thing that just randomly kind of crushes you some of the time. And even if they're not going to be able to images that Sam Wilson shield, what they can do is just move it to a location they're not actually going to contest, and contest the other 2 locations, which effectively a lot of the time has the same effect as making your Scream not actually scaling by 4, but only scaling by 2. This is also a card they can use to prevent clogs. Like, I've had games where it's like, oh, I expect a Stegron here, so I'm gonna fill up the lane that Stegron would be pushing something to with my Sam Wilson shield. Like, there's kind of a lot of utility that, like, the combination of Sam Wilson images of Icon has against you, not the least of which is just, oh, okay, I'm going to just turn my stuff into Gwenpools or Galactas and outpower you even though you have a Scream that's active. It just doesn't even matter anymore. Plus, you're not playing Shang-Chi, so if they do it with the Agamotto, you just kind of instantly lose that lane. If they get like 39 power off of that, you're not beating it. You need to be able to disrupt them meaningfully with your moves, which is tough because one of the things that has changed in this deck recently is that your 2s are much better. So you're doing a lot more of your 2s and your own scaling with like Sam and Kraven and Iron Patriot and all that stuff, and a lot less of the actual move stuff a lot of the time until the later turns of the game. Notable. And so like you have this deck that is in theory sort of the mid-range deck that beats other mid-range decks, but in practice, because they all have Sam Wilson, because they have a bunch of images of Icon, it doesn't always line up that way, which I think is good, because it doesn't mean that like this deck is unplayable or anything. It does mean that what was previously set in stone as like the mid-range god is no longer that. My favorite iteration of Wiccan right now is this one. Now, there is one choice in here that I don't super love, but I understand why it was made, and that choice is to run the Kate Bishop over Sam Wilson. I think Sam Wilson's just like really that good and should be run in basically everything, but Kate Bishop has some like notable, like, okay, I need to do my Wiccan stuff, like I need my, like, I like a 2 into a 2, I need a 1-drop to play, like, I get it, right? The other question would then be like, are we better off not running the Fenris Wolf package? And I think right now the Fenris Wolf package is quite valuable, in part because of things like Agamotto, or like the Gwenpool stuff, or like the Galactus stuff that is happening. There's gonna be a lot of targets for a Shang-Chi, but especially if they're spreading their power well, one Shang-Chi isn't gonna do it. So having what is effectively, not literally, but functionally sometimes, a second Shang-Chi's worth of power in the form of a Fenris Wolf can be very good for allowing your Shang-Chi to sort of affect multiple lanes when fundamentally you are playing a deck that simply does not do as many points as a lot of the Agamotto decks. And so I think that deck building strategy is roughly reasonable, where it's just like, look, if we play all the Sam stuff, we're both doing the same thing, but theirs is better with Agamotto. So let's just try to do something else entirely, and that's what Wiccan is on right now. Negasonic, a uniquely powerful card late in the game, should be pointed out. There are a lot of decks right now that are definitely focused on playing for 2 lanes on the final turn of the game by playing effectively 2 cards on the final turn of the game. Pay attention to that, because those are the decks that Negasonic is very good against. Classic Move. Now, this is a deck that was typically built on the power output of the move cards alongside the shutdown mechanics of both Alioth and Cosmo. This can make it very difficult to play against and very difficult to play because a lot of your final turns are reads or guesses in terms of whether or not you're playing Heimdall, whether you're playing Alioth, are you moving a Cosmo, are you moving a Scalar, where is that going to end up, who has priority? Those are all questions you have to ask yourself at the end of every game with or against this list. I do think it has some real upside right now. This is a proven successful tactic, and I think that there's a little more worth doing in the mid-rangey move shell right now than in move bounce, thank God. I'm not saying move bounce is bad per se. What I am saying is that right now it seems a little inconsistent, and there are decks that can really match the output that it has on its worst draws. Like when, let's say there's just like one scaling vulture, well, I mean, like an Images of Icon Agamotto deck can match that pretty easily. And so it's not the same level of stat checking as Hela because it doesn't have the consistency of Hela, where this deck is much more able to play a normal mid-range game against a bunch of stuff and then also have the ability to nullify later plays if necessary, or if they're not a deck that has interaction or plays you need to nullify, just go as tall as possible with Heimdall stuff. One of the minor trends that I've been noting is people messing around with sort of Ajax-less Ajax decks, or even something that would be better described as just like Malekith mid-range. The impetus for this list came from Stefan, who is someone I've cited a lot of the time as sort of like the Malekith mid-range guy in my head. Formerly the super giant guy, just kind of a guy who likes doing stuff with that sort of offbeat timing. This is actually from Zombies Go Nom Nom, a list that was based on the Stefan list, leaning a little more into Affliction right now. The idea here is basically just cut out all the BS. Remember when I talked about how Ajax was a useful tool for these decks, but not a required one, where it was only really required when you needed to go super tall, and a lot of the time what this deck actually wants to be doing is like 4+2 on 6 a lot of the time? That's kind of the idea here, where we have like our final turn US Agent plus whatever other big thing. We have all of this ability to like cheat energy with Anti-Venom, with Malekith. Note also the Gladiator for big Malekith pulls. Like, that's really what this deck is doing. Fundamentally, the idea here is actually to play something closer to like a Sera control slash, afflict your opponent with things, then let Diamondback carry you. Like, we just kind of want to be able to use our affliction cards as tech cards or lane winners. Things like US Agent, things like Diamondback, those are going to be able to do a ton of damage to like big lanes that have a lot of stuff in them. You have your Gorgon in order to make sure that you don't actually end up on the wrong side of various Thanoses and Arishems and even Agamottos some of the time. The goal here is to play sort of a very small, in terms of like overall points game, while making your opponent's overall points even less than yours. This is the version of the sort of Afflict list that I'm going to be showing here. I do think that you could very easily just play last week's version, where it's just the same Ajax deck we've always played, but I think it's worth showing what people are trying right now in opposition to that Ajax stuff. There are a bunch of Thanos lists right now with varying levels of success. In my opinion, they're taking a lot of hits from the amount of people playing Gorgon. Gorgon is much better against Thanos than it is against basically any other card in Marvel Snap. People are playing Gorgon for, Agamotto, Arishem, whatever. It's good there. It's great against Thanos. It is absolutely goated against Thanos. In fact, if they're not playing 3 stones by turn 2, you're probably snapping a Gorgon most of the time against this deck, because what they care about stones doing, like if they're not Mind Stone turn 1, 2 stones turn 2, you're snapping Gorgon a lot of the time, because you're taking them off of what makes this deck dangerous, which is the ability to go wide and the ability to then use that wide board to play a cheap Mockingbird. Once you do that, they are a much more predictable deck, and so if they're like passing turn 1, you're snapping a Gorgon almost all of the time. You are just going to run them over, because what this Thanos deck is able to do is legitimately powerful. Don't get me wrong, you can do some strong stuff in a Thanos shell, but what it really cares about is it needs to be a Mockingbird deck. Like, in order for this deck to be really good, what it wants to do is like turn 5 Thanos, non-Shang-Chi-able, because you have the green stone and of course the orange stone, and then what it wants to do is go like 6+ Mockingbird if it can. That's the nut draw. It's very unlikely, but like that's the idea. And so like maybe you're gonna do, Thanos on 5, indestructible, and then Shang-Chi plus Mockingbird. That's a much more like reasonable thing to do. Call Obsidian plus Mockingbird. Much more reasonable. Again, you get the idea though. Like that's sort of the play pattern that the deck hinges on. If it's just playing one card on the final turn of the game, you're probably going to be able to beat it most of the time. I've had a shocking amount of success with this Silver Surfer list. It's honestly just been pretty great for me. I will say that a lot of that success was before the Sandman deck started showing up, and I don't really think that deck is a great matchup for this. However, there are ways, of course, to play around it. You just rely a lot more on Hope Summers. Hope Summers allowing you to get 2 3s out in the Sandman matchup is very important. You can even, if you want, stack both of those 3s on the Hope Summers lane, which takes you to 8 energy on turn 6, which will allow you to play 2 3s on the final turn of the game as well. So getting to Hope Summers early against the Sandman deck is probably the most important thing you can do. You have like Hope Summers, and then you might have to end up filling that lane up in order to get your energy that you need, because it can be like that. But you have your Hope Summers, you play something there on 4, you play 2 things there on 5, and then hopefully one of them can move out, but maybe it can't. You will have access to all of your stuff being able to play through Sandman, and that is helpful, and it can matter a lot. That is sort of the thing that you have to be thinking about against the Sandman decks a lot of the time. Against everything else, this is just a deck that does points very well. I have enjoyed the point output here. I wonder about getting a third 2-drop in here. It would probably be Gorgon if I could do it. Not that I think Gorgon is good, but the games where you pass turn 1 and turn 2 are legitimately harder to win. The deck I've been referring to as Moonstone Overlap is one that sort of sprung up in the wake of Loki meta, which lasted like all of 2 days, if we're going to be real. But in that time, it was very valuable to just have a deck that was very hard to actually use if your opponent Loki'd it. And this deck is sort of like marrying 2 different things in a way that makes it pretty awkward for Loki gamers to actually play, because a lot of your early drops are not very good unless you're using them with your other cards, which means that there's just going to be a lot of dead draws for a Loki player. But what this deck has also done is shown a remarkable resiliency. Effectively, what this is doing is it is taking the old Victoria handshell and fusing the Moonstone Iron Man Mystique into there, so it just has the ability to have massive power explosions. There is the upside of using Moonstone with your V hand, which is very, very powerful, but the Iron Man Mystique stuff is how this deck manages to not really run any tech cards and still stay in games. There's no tech in here, not really, and this is sort of a combination of the half-man, half-amazing deck and the V-hand decks from about a month ago. That is how I would think about this list, and it has, in some ways, the best parts of both. It's a very powerful deck to be playing. The draws are uniquely strong, and it is the kind of thing that can throw people off. People aren't 100% familiar with this list. I remember when I played against this list, my chat was calling out all sorts of cards that were not in it. They were like, oh, I know what this is. It has Gorr. Nope. Not a lot of the time. Sometimes there are decks like this that can have Gorr, but this isn't one of them. And so, like, you have a lot of coverage from other people doing things like this. That means that you are able to go over the top of them or surprise them or create a bunch of weird game states with full power Iron Men and things like that they're just not really able to deal with. I never thought that, like, Sera Control would be the actual home for Starbrand. I thought that was, like, kind of far-fetched, but it does seem like it's shaping up to be what ends up being true here. This is just a really good stat stick, and you can cover for it with Sera Control by either enchantressing it or just making sure it doesn't actually have the effect that it has. This is just, like, bigger Gladiator, basically. That's the idea. And so I have, like, a genuine appreciation for people who are still doing stuff like this, but it is worth pointing out that, like, your average Sera is going to be probably worse in this deck than your average Bolts of Balthak is in, say, the Kittymoto deck, which is doing a lot of similar stuff without a lot of the downside. It's important to think about Sera in terms of what is the actual energy discount you're getting. If you're playing 3 cards, you're getting 3 energy off. If you're playing 4 cards, you're getting 4 energy off. If you're getting 4 energy off, that's when it starts to be about competitive with the Bolts of Balthak. I'm not overly invested, or I'm not overly confident that Sera ends up beating out the Agamotto version of doing this same thing, but I do think it's a nice kind of change of pace for this metagame. Scornhub is actually genuinely kind of a great deck right now, but it takes a lot of weird splash damage from the existence of Mobius, from the existence of Sandman, from the existence of Gorgon, because any combination of those will mean that your swarms are not going to be discarded by your bullseye, which takes the top off a lot of your nut draws, which in turn means I think that if you're seeing a lot of the Sandman deck, you're going to want to cut Gambit and you're going to want to go back to Grandmaster. And the reason for this is because if your big scaling off of the Collector and off of Morbius is out of the question, what you're going to want to be doing is playing the Dakin game, because that actually beats the hell out of Sandman. So I do think that that's a reasonable adaptation to make. If you see a bunch of Sandman stuff, you see a bunch of Mobius stuff, if you see a bunch of Gorgon stuff, it's the combination of those things that matters, right? Gorgon plus Sandman, there go all your 0 cost guys, right? Like, that matters a lot, right? Mobius just generally, there go all your 0 cost guys, that matters a lot. And so you have this deck where it's like, if you aren't running into this stuff in certain combinations, you're fine. But if you are running into this stuff, it takes you off of your nut draw, and you're gonna be like, damn, I really wish I committed to the Dakin plan instead. Because at least then, you know, let's say they Sandman you and you can't use your bullseye to discard the ones, you can still Modok them out of your hand. Mr. Negative is taking a bunch of heat right now, and all of it is due to Mobius and Mobius. Previous metagames, Mobius was not a very playable card, because what are you playing a 3/3 into Hela for? In this metagame, Mobius is a very playable card because a lot of people are doing a lot of weird crap, and so you end up with this deck taking a ton of splash damage, because if you try to queue up Mr. Negative, you have to snap aggressively. That is the whole premise of the deck. If you snap aggressively into a deck that could be playing Mobius, and that could be basically any deck at this point could be doing that, you're going to lose 4 to 8 cubes. And that's really bad. The good news is it's mostly going to be 4 cubes. Like, you're mostly going to be able to retreat to Mobiuses. They'll snap you back and you'll be like, all right, I know what that means. Or they'll snap you back and play a Mobius. In worst case scenario, you're losing 4. Like, maybe you'll be able to lose 2 a lot of the time. But it is a meaningful alteration to this deck's cube path. In addition, it also lost a very good matchup in the form of Hela. This was a deck that was sort of predicated on being bigger than Hela and being able to be one of the few decks that is not bullied by Hela, but instead bullies Hela. And now that's gone. You don't really have a lot of upside for it. Not a great negative metagame right now. On the a high rank player is succeeding with this, but I don't necessarily recommend it because it is a high rank player succeeding with its scale. I think it is worth talking about this deck, which is a deck made by Cougorr. Took it up to rank 3 at the time, I believe. It's a quite powerful deck, but it's one of those things where it's like, there is this fundamental thing that happens a lot where a high rank player will succeed with something, and then, you know, a bunch of YouTubers will get a hold of it and they'll be like, oh my god, the new rank 1 deck, this is going to be awesome. And it's like, not actually the deck, it's the player that got to rank 1. This happens a lot with people like Derek, it happens a lot with people like Butt, where it's just like, these are the players doing it, and they're doing it to do it within a certain niche and to leverage the fact that they have unknown information against opponents whose information are known, and because they're good enough to do it. And I think that this list from Cougorr likely is in that category where it's like, this is the kind of deck where if you don't know what it is, it can be very difficult to play against as a good player. But if you do know what it is and you know the range, it's actually much easier to deal with. And so I think there are a lot of decks that get propagated across Marvel Snap like that, where it's like the implicit promise of like the title is that like they are going to carry you. But what's really happening is a really good player is carrying the deck. And whenever I do one of these videos, I try really hard to make sure that my recommendations are for decks that will carry you. Like, I want you to come away from these videos with decks that will win games for you. Not decks that you need to put the effort into, not decks that a good player is carrying to a high rank, decks that will actually make you win more games just by virtue of playing them. And that's really where decks like this sort of fall off for me, where it's like it happens very often where like a top player will do very well with something and that will not be very easily replicatable. And I realize that can still happen in small sample sizes with anything, right? But I do think that it's worth taking a look and taking time before saying like, this deck is the best in the game, it's the new meta or whatever, and saying, okay, are we actually sure that's what's happening, or is it just Derek playing another deck? And so this is a deck that I think is sort of like that, where it's like, this is a very powerful deck if your opponent has no idea what you're doing. Like, this is unbelievably powerful. It has a bunch of incredibly wide-ranging final turn plays that are extremely unexpected. It's sort of like the other Moonstone deck that we talked about, but its ability to go tall is very different. The fact that it has the ability to double up Gorrs for cheap is very different. It's a very powerful thing to be doing. But I do think that once you recognize what's going on, it's like, oh, okay, I know I'm dead here. I'm not going to cope stay anymore. And so a deck like this is sort of taking advantage of cope stays at high levels because people want to know what's going on. And I do think that if I were to suggest that this deck is sort of replicatable in terms of performance by your average player, I kind of would guess that the answer is no. By the same token, here's the latest Derekhawk cook, and I think there's a lot of upside in trying to find the best Darkhawk list right now. Like, I'm a big fan of being a Darkhawk gamer if I can. It's just that whenever I play this list, I kind of mess around and I'm like, I don't really like the Wiccan. And then if you're not Wiccaning, the Darkhawk feels weird. Darkhawk's in a weird position where he's like definitely good, but I'm not sure we have any idea what the right 12 cards to play in your Darkhawk deck are beyond Darkhawk himself. I tried the Goon Knight stuff. I tried a couple of Darkhawk lists, actually. None of them felt perfect just yet, so this is more like a TBD. This is a good place to start, but I think a lot of people watching this could benefit from, like, let's just try and figure out what the best Darkhawk deck actually is and see if we can get him to a reasonable spot in terms of power level, because he's getting, like, +8 against the Nagamoto deck. There are people playing Thanos, there are people playing Arishem where he's just absolutely unbeatable. There's got to be something, but we got to find out what the shell is. Speaking of Arishem, this deck is taking splash damage out the wazoo. There's people playing Gorgon, that's really bad for you. There's a bunch of people that are going very tall with Iron Men, Moonstone type things, that's very bad for you. It feels like every time I play Arishem, I find myself wondering what the good matchups even are, because typically the idea with a deck like this is I'm gonna be the mid-range crusher, and that only ever actually happens if you're doing something like Iron Patriot on 2 and a Galacta on 3, and it's like, then yeah, you're crushing mid-range, but like a lot of the time, you're not doing that. And so Arishem has sort of become this deck where it's like, do things, several question marks, Alioth, win game. And that's kind of it. And so like you have this weird deck where it's like, your plan is just figure out a way to scam your opponent out of the game somehow. By like legioning really early on like the location that blows up everything on turn 4. Or just something scammy, just do something scammy, figure it out. And that's kind of the ethos of Arishem right now. A lot of mid-range decks are going to be able to outscale you. Like, that is just sort of fundamentally what's happened with mid-range decks with Sam Wilson, with Iron Patriot, with really powerful endgames, with Agamotto. There are decks that can do more points than you that are typically supposed to be your good matchups, and that is a scary thing for Arishem to realize. This is also the kind of deck where its game plans are not particularly reliable. I don't know what its good matchups are. I just don't. I can imagine that some of them exist theoretically, but like most of them involve, I'm going to figure out some way to BS you out of this game. The Bruce is slightly looser than he has been in the past. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Bruce Banner is amazing, but he's a little bit more functional as a card, and this list is a little bit more functional as a list than it otherwise ever has been. Bruce Banner is a genuinely strong card if you're able to, like, skip enough energy. Like, you're gonna get that 12 pretty regularly. I don't think it's enough necessarily to bring high Evo back into the metagame. This is another deck that takes some real splash damage from anything that is able to play Mobius and is then able to just be like, oh, well, you're playing one card a turn the rest of the game. I don't really care. I'm just going to win if you're playing one card a turn. This deck really does sort of count on She-Hulk to not be a one card a turn deck, and the Afflict and bonus stuff is rarely enough to offset how bad it is to be a one card a turn deck, even if that one card a turn is like a 24 power Hulk. It's just like, you really need to be able to contest multiple lanes a lot of the time because of the amount of people playing Shang-Chi. You also have to be running Kyera because otherwise people are just going to blow up your Bruce, or they're going to blow up your Sunspot that gets the 10 power, which happens actually kind of a lot whenever you get Sunspot early. It's good enough to play, which is not something I would have said about this archetype previously. But, like, you can play this and it won't be like the world's most embarrassing thing. You'll be in games, you'll be able to play Marvel Snap, things will happen. And that is good. It's good that you have that ability now, because I've always been a high Evo fan. I think it's nice that high Evo is able to make this stuff legitimately powerful. I just don't think it's going to be tier 1 or even maybe tier 2 a lot of the time. One of the funnier things that happens when you really, like, track untapped stats the way that I do is seeing a deck that you know is bad have, like, a really good win rate in a really small sample, and then watching people copy it and just watching the win rate just, like, absolutely crater. That happened to Destroy, where, like, there was like a 50 game sample of like 60% win rate with this list, and then by the time I ended up making this video, it was like 150 game and the win rate had already cratered to like 53%, which implies horrible things about the 100 games that were played. Like, that win rate is probably much lower than 53% in that context. Like, it's bad. And so Destroy is, yeah, it's, you know, Lmao. It's a little more playable than it was, but it's still not very playable. It has the same problems it's always had, which is this is a deck that scales very high in terms of I get my stuff early, but it also needs to get its stuff early in order to scale very high and takes random splash damage from, like, basically every tech card that's ever been relevant in the game. Oh no, Enchantress is playable, my Null sucks now. Oh no, my opponents have Killmonger, they can throw priority and blow up my Deadpool. Oh no, people are playing Mobius, my Death is bad now. Like, there's just kind of a lot of stuff where you're just like, oh man, if they didn't do that, I'd probably win. But like, the stuff is so common that someone's always gonna do it, you know? It just takes damage from so many different little pieces that it's like a little bit hard to justify playing this. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching that video. I truly hope you enjoyed it. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Please remember, like, subscribe, leave a comment. All those things help me out. Later.